Good morning. It's delightful to be speaking even virtually at New York Zendo. I recognize some familiar faces in the gloom. Hello to all of you. I am going to be speaking this morning about why I am in fact somewhat present in New York Zendo and speaking to you right now. In other words, how I got here. I am at least from a family that is at least a fourth generation atheist. Both my mother and my father's families arrived here in the 1890s, and they left everything behind them. In both cases, the families were given the name of the place they came from, either from a clerical error at Ellis Island or because they did not want to remember their original names. Among them, they spoke 5 languages, none of which they passed on to the children. They left behind all organized religion. So there was basically no roots of any spiritual practice in my family. I do know that we took my grandmother to the original production of Fiddler on the Roof, and she came out and said, well, that's exactly what it was like. So I sort of know where I come from, but I think there was less singing and dancing, and probably the clothing wasn't quite as nice. We came from a small piece of Poland that Poland and Russia were in conflict for 2,000 years. Every time one of them won a particular war, they would make the other person take this little sliver of land. No one apparently wanted it. The only stories I know about my mother's father, who died before I was born, was that although most people left Poland, his part of Poland, because they did not want to be impressed into the Tsar's army, my grandfather, in fact, left because he was going to be hanged as a horse thief if they caught him. I'm not sure I believe this, but he apparently liked telling stories. The other thing I know about him is that one day a rabbi came to call at the house, presumably because he never saw them anywhere, and my grandfather chased him away with a shotgun. These are very dramatic, but they made me understand that my family had no relation whatsoever to any kind of organized religion, and possibly honest society. I think, like many of the people in this room, many of the people at Zen Studies, in my childhood, I began tuning out for periods. I certainly didn't know what it was, but I would stop my thoughts and just be aware of everything around me with no verbalizations whatsoever in my mind, which was a sort of meditation. I recognized it once I actually began to meditate. And I do remember that when I was about 5, I asked my mother, I was going to public school, and all the little girls had either crosses or stars of David around their neck. So I went to my mother and said, hey, I shouldn't have a cross, I should probably have a star of David. Can I have one? And my mother, thinking back of it, probably heaved a long sigh and gave me the speech. She said to me, no, you can't, because we're atheists. We don't believe in God. We don't do the right thing because God makes us do it or wants us to do it. We do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And we always try to do that. And I was 5 years old. I thought this was a wonderful explanation. I got it. And as I grew up, I did sort of notice, and thinking back on my family, that like every family, we have our issues. But everybody does try to do the right thing all the time. So if I had to talk about a practice in my family, that would probably be it. We're good because it's the right thing to do. We celebrated Christmas, we celebrated Hanukkah, we had ham on Easter, we had chicken at Passover. I grew up in New York City, where I lived surrounded by a wide variety of Christians, a wide variety of Jews, Muslims, practitioners of voodoo. I don't know that I ever ran into any Buddhists during growing up in New York City, but probably because it was something that I didn't have in my childhood. I had an intense interest in religion, why people thought, what they believed, how it affected their life. So time went on. I went into 7th grade. That used to be called junior high school. I think it's called something else now, but it was the transition. You were now not in grammar school anymore. They actually expected you to do some work and to start growing up. And in 7th grade, the entire school, as they passed through, took 7th grade biology taught by Mrs. Lilienthal. Mrs. Lilienthal theoretically gave a course in the morphology of plants and animals, and how nature worked, and the plants and animals of New York City, with many field trips. What she really taught you was how to be a high school student, how to do homework, how to have some discipline in what you did, how to study, how to get on with your classmates, how to act in class, and how to respond to people. She was honest, she was kind, she was very firm, and looking back, there were many corrections in her class. She was one of those teachers that just stayed with you, and you would occasionally hear her voice in your ears saying, so why are you doing that? What do you mean by that? Is that really what you want to say? And I remember hearing at that point that she had something to do with something called Zen Buddhism. I had no idea what Zen Buddhism was. There was no internet at that point for me to look it up on, and I probably wasn't terrifically interested because my interest in her was as a person. She was a really wonderful person to be around. So I finished 7th grade, I went on to 8th grade, I progressed through high school. Something like 10th grade, I heard a radio broadcast. It was an interview of somebody called Colin Turnbull. Dr. Turnbull was an anthropologist from Oxford who had gone to Africa to study. He was an ethnomusicologist, and he had gone to Africa to study indigenous music and ended up living with the Mbuti people. The Mbuti people were pygmies in the Ituri forest, and he started out by recording their music, but he found them to be remarkable people. They were open, they were kind, they were non-judgmental, they did what they needed to do for surviving, and they were nice to all the people around them. So he ended up as a 6-foot-tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Scotsman with tattoos all over his forehead, indicating that he had been initiated into the Mbuti tribe. He wrote a book called The Forest People, about them, which is still used in anthropology courses as to how to, the new anthropology of how to look at people as themselves and not quite as metrically as some early anthropologists did. And he gave a wonderful interview, and he mentioned in the interview that he was now the associate curator of African studies at Natural History Museum. And he was looking for interns for the summer. So I immediately contacted the Natural History Museum and ended up as a group of 6 or 8 interns working for him over that summer. What we did was we went to storage in the museum of African artifacts that had been donated and labeled, but then put away and forgotten for many, many years. And he taught us how to take them out, do some basic cleaning, catalog them manually on index cards in the catalog, and to be very careful if they had any sharp points to avoid them, because the chance was strong that they were poisoned if they were any kind of implement, because they might be a weapon. Dr. Turnbull was a wonderful guy. He was accepting, he was clear, he was totally open to the interns, he was helpful, he was non-judgmental. He took us out for ice cream once a week at the place behind the Natural History Museum. And he had a friend called Norbu who came to visit him once a week or so, and they would go out to lunch. But Norbu would also spend time with the interns, just talking to us about his experience and our experience and what it was like to work there and how we felt about growing up in America. And somebody told me that Norbu was the brother of the Dalai Lama, which he actually was, it turns out. But I didn't know who the Dalai Lama was, so I was somewhat unimpressed by this. I just thought that he was fun to be with. Years later, when we had the internet, I wondered whatever happened to Dr. Turnbull, and I looked him up on the internet, which you may want to do, Colin Turnbull. He had a long history of studying with prominent Indian gurus, it turns out. And he was later in life ordained in the Tibetan tradition. His name was Lobsang Rigdo. And he died in a monastery here in the United States. His book is now known among anthropologists for making the point that the culture of the pygmies of the Ituri forest, who hunted and gathered for a living, was equal to or more pleasant or more quality than the culture of Western Europe. And he definitely found Buddha nature in everything that they did. But of course, I didn't know that at the time. I just thought that this was somebody who was sort of forming how I looked at other bits of the world and how I dealt with people and how I dealt with having a job, because it was probably my first job. So 2 years later, I'm in high school, I'm graduating, and my mother gets a letter from someplace saying, I've been accepted into a program that we had no memory of applying for. It turned out that the school was asked to recommend students who could do college level work to a program run by a foundation. It was at Ithaca each summer. And when I entered the program, they placed me at random in one or two sections. The first section was American imperialism in South America in the 19th century. The second program was the phenomenology of mystical experience. And I was placed in the phenomenology of mystical experience and spent 6 weeks reading everything that was available in English about mysticism, from early Christian mystics right through to Timothy Leary. Now, this was 1966, so anything after 1966 I wouldn't have read. And as a final project, we all had to do a presentation on whether enlightenment obtained through meditation was the same as, superior to, check one, enlightenment obtained through the use of chemicals. In other words, is it the same as you meditate as if you take LSD? I'm pretty sure I came down on the side that it was different if you meditated. I'm not sure at this moment really what the answer is, but this is still hotly debated in the Zen world. So I was chugging along, very little change in my spiritual life, no change in my spiritual life. Went through college, went through graduate school, went to work. And in my mid-20s, I developed an illness that was in my immune system, based and inflammatory, not the kind of thing doctors can do much about. And I dealt with the doctors for a while, and then I remembered that I knew all about meditation. And I had read all about meditation, right through Henry James, right up to Timothy Leary, right up to psychoanalysts who wrote about the effects of meditation. And I said to myself, well, the doctor's not working, I'm going to try meditation. And then the other chunk fell into place in my mind. And I said to myself, meditation. Well, Zen Buddhism was good enough for Mrs. Lilienthal. It's good enough for me. So I reached for the yellow pages, which is something we used to have, and I looked up Zen Buddhist temples near Manhattan, and there were 3 of them. One of them was in Westchester. One of them was in the East 20s. That was the beginning of Village Zendo. And one of them was on East 67th Street, which was near where I went to school, so I knew the neighborhood. And it was called Zen Studies. And I said to myself, well, I'm really good at studying. I'm going to try Zen Studies. And I showed up on Thursday night. And what they used to do on Thursday night for many years was there was 45 minutes of instruction. And then the group was led down and joined a Sangha for Kinhin. And at the end of Sangha, they were led back upstairs for another 45 minutes of test meditation, instruction, questions, whatever. So I went in, and at that point, there was someone standing at the door demanding $5 before you went upstairs. And I went to the instruction, and I came down the stairs, and they fed us into the Kinhin line, and I came into the Zendo. And it was perfectly clear to me at that point that this was where I was, then and there. This was where I needed to be, and this was where I was going to stay. And I have to assume that the couple of layers of completely unsolicited Buddhist instruction that I had received over my life got me to this place. So I walked, karma gave me one last push in the back as I walked into the Zendo, and that was it. And this is where I've stayed. Occasional side trips to Daibosatsu, essentially for the rest of my life. I've never left. I later found out that Mrs. Lilienthal was Chigetsu. Chigetsu had started sitting with Edo Roshi when they sat in the apartment on West End Avenue, and was part of the group that founded and moved us into New York Zendo, where you are now. She is buried at DBZ in Sangha Meadow, and when I was a resident there, I used to visit her frequently. So that is essentially how I got here. Shinge Roshi frequently reminds us that there are no coincidences. And I have a great struggle in my mind because I am a believer in science. I am a follower of Spock. I'm a rationalist. But on the other hand, it seems pretty clear to me that coming from a start of total no-knowing, I was pushed little by little, bit by bit, to New York Zendo and to this practice. So I've taken this as a lesson for myself, just to be aware of what the Dharma, my karma, the world, the universe seems to be pushing me towards, because there may be something there I should pay attention to and follow. I had to look up Dr. Turnbull on the web when I began putting this together, because I didn't know his Dharma name. And I found he was a very prominent anthropologist, but he also did some writings toward the end of his life on Buddhism and his own practice. And he, there was one passage that struck with me, because it has reflected my own attitude toward what my practice has been for the past 45, I hate to say, years. And this is what he wrote. As an academic, I'm tired of the mind and the tricks it can play. Tired of the insidious ways the mind constantly anchors one in samsara. Tired of a life in which the mind is considered the major, if not the only weapon for self-preservation, and yet one that is by itself exceptionally inadequate for spiritual growth and for preservation of the spiritual self. When I began sitting, one thing that attracted me deeply to Zen Buddhism was that it didn't want to hear me talk. In fact, this is the first Dharma talk I've ever given. It didn't want to hear me theorize. It didn't want to hear me talk about Buddhism. It just wanted me to sit and find whatever else was there. And I had gone through 6 years of college and grad school in which gold stars were given by how you could manipulate language. So my struggle, my struggle for my entire practice has been letting go of language. And I just found this passage that Dr. Turnbull wrote to be very resonant of what I've been going through and will continue to work on. So that really is why you're hearing me today and why I'm sitting here. I wish I could be with you in person. And perhaps someday in the near future I will, but I thank you.